The worst part of this mystery disease is how it was determined that it was being spread. A young woman named An stood in the middle of a huge sugarcane grove in an isolated forest in Papua New Guinea. And around her were all her relatives and neighbors, and they were all there to mourn the loss of An's sister, whose name was Tan. She had passed away 3 days earlier from a very mysterious illness that people in An's village called kuru. And in their language, the word kuru meant trembling. This particular mystery illness only affected the people in An and Tan's village. As soon as you began to tremble, that was kind of like the first sign. 1 year or so after that moment, you lose control of all the muscles in your body until you die. And so ever since Tan's death 3 days earlier, the village had been performing all these rituals and prayers in an attempt to assist Tan's spirit on its way into the afterlife. An and her family and all of these villagers were members of the Foray people, who were native to Papua New Guinea, which is an island just north of Australia. And in 1953, when the story is taking place, the Foray people numbered about 11,000 people. They were beginning to fear that they were going to go extinct because of kuru. Every year, the Foray people lost 200 people to kuru. And for the most part, the victims were women, like disproportionately so, which made it even more likely that the Foray people would go extinct. But the Foray people did not view kuru as just an illness. They actually viewed it as a curse. And so the Foray people put on these really elaborate funerals, mostly to ward off these dark magic sorcerers that were casting kuru spells. If the village is able to nail it perfectly, then the deceased, who's passed away from kuru, so in this case An's sister Tan, her spirit, as a result of this perfect funeral, would be able to kind of rise up and actually seek revenge on the sorcerer who killed the person. And so An and the rest of her villagers, they went through this very elaborate process for An's sister Tan, and at the end of it, they did feel like they had really nailed it. A few weeks after An's sister's funeral, An was standing over an open fire, and she was cooking some pork and sweet potatoes, and as she went to flip the meat over, she reached her hand out, and she noticed her hand was trembling, which is the first sign of someone with kuru. After about a month from that first time she noticed her hand shaking, she noticed she wasn't really able to stand up without kind of losing her balance because her legs were starting to tremble. And finally, when she basically couldn't even stand up without assistance, she knew she had kuru. She couldn't stand the idea of having this horrible, slow, painful death. And so she decided, you know what? I'm going to do something drastic that basically nobody else had done before who had kuru. At this time, the Foray people had been totally isolated from other people in the world for thousands of years. Starting in the 1950s, some Australian colonists and researchers and police actually began kind of making their way in and around the Foray people's area. An and the rest of the people in her village, they did not like having these Australian people kind of wandering around. But An is thinking, you know, the people in my village, the Foray people, they have no solutions for me. Maybe they have some answers about what I can do to stop myself from dying from this horrible curse. And very likely, even if she was able to find a solution from these outsiders, it's not clear if she would have been welcomed back into her village. And so this is a truly desperate measure she's taking. And she began kind of hobbling her way quietly and discreetly out of her village, something that she really never did. And she eventually came to a clearing where there was this house. She went up and knocked on the door, and a second later it opened up, and it's this Australian anthropologist named Ronald Burnt, who actually An had seen before. And An begins to try to tell him what's going on with her. And as she began to talk, the words she was saying were coming out all garbled, and she realized that the kuru curse was now affecting her throat, the muscles in her neck, and she was not able to speak. But as it happened, Ronald, who was very familiar with the Foray people, he could tell that very likely this woman was here because she believed she had kuru. And Ronald, who had learned about kuru after studying the Foray people, he had done some research on it, and he believed it was entirely psychosomatic, that this was not an actual illness. Basically, he believed kuru was acute hysteria, that these Foray people were just going crazy and convincing themselves that they had this illness, and I guess that kind of manifested their death a year later. And so Ronald interrupted An, who again is struggling to talk, and he was able to communicate to her in her language that you do not have kuru, you are hysterical, this is in your head, and you should go now. And then he shut the door on her. She turned around and just went back to her village. 9 months later, An's condition had severely deteriorated. That interaction with Ronald had kind of destroyed her hope, and so she did go back and just was kind of waiting to die, just like everybody else in her village did. But for An, the physical symptoms of Kuru that she was experiencing were undoubtedly terrible, but they were not as bad, at least to An, as the other side of Kuru. Sometimes, Foray people would refer to this curse, this illness, as the laughing death. And it's because during the terminal stage, so the end stage of Kuru, when you're just about to die, you just begin laughing. It doesn't matter what you're thinking about. This is not an actual laugh. You're not thinking something's funny, but you keep hysterically laughing, which makes your whole body sore from constantly laughing over and over again. And An was beginning to experience that. And finally, just a few weeks after she had begun the laughing side of Kuru, An would pass away, almost exactly 1 year from when she first noticed the trembling in her hand. After An's death, more and more people just kept on getting Kuru. 7 years after An's death, so in 1961, a medical anthropologist named Shirley Lindenbaum was sitting in her office at City University in New York, reading over old scientific articles. And as she was just kind of flipping through them, she noticed there was an article from an Australian anthropologist named Ronald Burt. And in this article, Ronald outlined these symptoms that the Foray people were exhibiting that obviously were not real. They had tremors, loss of muscle control, and huge mood swings. But Ronald was like, it's all in their head. It's not a real disease. But to Shirley, as she's reading this, she's thinking, why has Ronald decided this has to be psychosomatic? These symptoms seem like a real disease, like a neurological condition. Something must be attacking their brains, causing them to have these symptoms and then die. She discovered that there was basically no real research other than Ronald's about this weird illness. And so she decided, you know what? There's a gap in the research, and I'm gonna fill it. She left New York and flew to Papua New Guinea, and she made her way into the forests to contact the Foray people. And eventually she reached some of these small villages that contained Foray people, and the Foray people, even if they didn't necessarily embrace Shirley, many of them were open to at least speaking to her and talking about their culture, their customs, their history, and of course talking about Kuru, this curse. And eventually Shirley made her way into this one particular Foray village where she actually saw a white man just walking around in this village. So he really stood out. And so immediately Shirley walked up to this guy and he introduced himself as Dr. Michael Alpers, and he told Shirley he had been living in these villages with the Foray people for several months because he was studying Kuru. And so Shirley and Dr. Alpers were totally aligned, and they're like, hey, let's swap notes and do this together. And so she told Dr. Alpers that now her working theory was that Kuru was actually a contagious type of encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain. But Shirley also said to Dr. Alpers that that did not explain why so many victims of Kuru were female. And Shirley also said to Dr. Alpers that, I've been around loads of people with Kuru, and I don't have it, so how can it be contagious? When he began trying to answer this question, he discovered that actually, in addition to lots of women getting Kuru, also lots of kids got Kuru. And in fact, Dr. Alpers told Shirley that right now there was a 12-year-old boy who was in the final stage of Kuru, so the laughing stage, the terminal stage, and because this boy's parents knew their son was going to die, they were so desperate and grief-stricken that when Dr. Alpers came by and offered to do an autopsy on their son when he passed to try to learn more, parents agreed. A few days later, Dr. Alpers found Shirley, and he told her that the 12-year-old boy had passed away, and so now it was time to conduct the autopsy. And there was a makeshift autopsy table with this boy's body on it. And while Shirley really could not stand to watch this actually happen, she did go over after Dr. Alpers had opened up the boy's skull, revealing his brain. And he yelled to her, hey, you have to come over here and look at this. And so Shirley walked over and she looked down. She knew right away there's something terribly wrong with that brain. And so Shirley and Dr. Alpers immediately knew this brain has to be sent off for further testing. About a year later, Shirley was back home in New York in her office when she received a letter from a research team at the United States National Institutes of Health. And so she ripped it open and pulled out the report and began reading. And the researchers said they had spent the last year, studying this brain tissue, and while they still didn't really understand how Kuru even happened, but they had discovered something about how Kuru spread. During one of their experiments, the NIH researchers had injected some tissue from this boy's brain into a chimpanzee, and very quickly, that chimpanzee developed Kuru. And so this told the researchers that yes, Kuru was contagious, and it spread through infected brain tissue. But how one person's infected brain got into another person's brain was the big mystery. But as Shirley read this, Because she had done all that research when she went into the forests of Papua New Guinea and spoke to all these 4A people, she had learned a lot, and she actually knew exactly how something like this could happen, something that only the 4A people were doing. Shirley had learned that 4A people believe all humans have 5 distinct souls. There was that one soul that 4A people believed they could basically summon up out of a deceased person that would then go avenge that person's death, but that was just one soul. There were 4 others. And of these 4 others, there was one called the Quila, which was the most dangerous. Quila meant flesh in the 4A people's language, and this soul was like a manifestation of death and decay. And so they believed after someone died, their flesh needed to be stored properly. Otherwise, it would pollute the air and cause more death and decay for other people that were still alive. And the safest place was inside of a woman's body. And the reason for this is 4A people believe women's bodies are much more resilient than men's, and so if anybody could withstand holding Quila inside of them, it would be the women. But there was a very specific process that the 4A women had to follow in order to kind of put this Quila inside of themselves. The way it worked is a few days after a 4A member has passed away, this huge feast is prepared. Except the feast only consists of the Quila. Basically, the person who is dead is and prepared by the women, like their entire body gets. And it just so happened that during these funeral feasts, when they were consuming the Quila, the brain of the deceased person was an absolute delicacy. And so the brain was reserved for close female relatives of the deceased person. Shirley had learned that a lot of these women who were given the brain, this delicacy during these funerals, they would often sneak little pieces of the brain and hand it out to kids as like a little treat. That's why the kids were also getting kuru. And so a few years after this incredible discovery by Shirley about how kuru was being passed along, the Australian colonial government banned the practice of ritualistic cannibalism in Papua New Guinea, and so kuru was virtually eradicated, and the 4A population, instead of sliding towards extinction, actually began to grow really fast. And today, the total population has at least doubled. It took until 1990 to actually figure out what was going on inside of these people's bodies when they had kuru. Because back in the 60s, when they figured out how not to get kuru, nobody understood what was even happening. It was just like, don't eat other people and you'll be okay, but that's all they knew. And while the process in the human body that caused kuru remained a mystery for many decades after Shirley's big discovery, in the 1990s, researchers did finally figure out what's actually going on. Basically, somebody with kuru has these proteins in their brain called prions that fold wrong into the wrong shape and then cannot function properly. This loss of protein function rapidly kills brain cells, which in turn shrivels up the brain and causes all those holes all over it.